your story about how you got here. How did you get to Rutgers?
Well, I got here because it was near to Columbia, where I was still going to graduate school and still working on my PhD, and also because I was going with the man I then married, and we're in our 49th year of marriage at this point, but that time we were kids, and he was at Princeton, getting a degree there in philosophy. So came time, we needed money and I needed a job. So it was not a focus on Douglas, which I had not heard that much about. But the more I learned about it, the more intriguing it sounded to me. And I did apply to other places. I applied to a school which will remain nameless, and was told in a reply after I had called on them that they were looking for a man. So, you know, that was that day.
Yeah, talk about the difference between being in the traditional Ivy League versus coming to a public Ivy League.
Well, it was in many ways thrilling, but it took me a while to get the place, you know, and it still is difficult to explain to people that there is something so special about the college system that emerged here. And of course, the college system had a lot to do with the fact that Rutgers College was one of the 9 colonial male institutions, and they held out for a long time against admitting women under any circumstances, certainly not coeducation. But the upshot of that was the opportunity to have a women's college in a public state university, which is quite unique. And I think that explains a lot that is special about how we came sooner to be able to establish a women's studies program, for example. The other thing was having all the graduate students here made a huge difference in resources, in research that could be undertaken on women, and also the people that were attracted because they were close to New York City. So, and we got lots of jokes about, well, where did you come from when we came to Douglas? Did they pick you up in the Princeton A&P, you know? And we tried to ride with those.
You wrote your first book is about Victorian murderesses. Did you find any in the New Brunswick, Princeton area?
Well,
Any murders on
when my husband was at Princeton, I was at...
I'm sorry.
You just have to, yeah, you can't overlap because
I'm
we're not
sorry.
gonna use
I'll just
questions,
re-ask the
so,
question.
yeah,
I'll try to
thanks.
be mindful and re-ask. Go ahead. Any Victorian murderers in the vicinity of Rutgers?
Well, what happened was back in the day, there was not such a thing as women's history or women's studies. At the time that I took my degree, I was trained in political history. But the ferment was here starting in the late 60s about women and women's history and women's studies. And I was caught up in that. It's rather insane to think now that someone would have the opportunity to switch fields entirely before the tenure issues came up. But in those days, I wasn't alone in deciding, okay, I was told, you're in good standing. You could get tenure here, and just turn your dissertation into a book. And I discovered that I couldn't do it. And then I happened to be doing some reading one day, and I came across a book called Victorian Studies in Scarlet, and by a man named Richard Altick, and it was not women's history at all, but I saw the possibilities of, if I could find enough, my topic then was middle-class women, if I could find enough women in France and England who had been accused of committing murder and they had cases that went to trial, I could use those cases to show not how atypical they were, but how in fact they created chords in the women who in fact came to those trials in both France and England, though there were different patterns in the two countries. And they brought their lunches, they had, their friends came to these trials, and you saw how they related to the struggles that had led a few women to desperate, desperate solutions.
What do you mean created chords? You said they create chords? You said they created chords.
Chords, they responsive chords in more ordinary middle-class women who never would have dreamed of going to the lengths of murder, but who knew and related to the experiences. And my theory was that in general, we learn something about women, of course, from the novels, and we know more from memoirs. But in fact, middle-class women's lives, their anxieties, their desperations, their focus in many ways has not been completed for us because they either took for granted what was going on or didn't talk about it. And the murders make everybody come out of the woodwork. And the servants testify, and the friends testify, and they all talk about things that weren't discussed regularly.
Using public records to get at the history.
Oh yeah, I went all over in France and England, and I was served by some fabulous local archivists who hadn't had people ask for these papers for many years. I was pulling out ancient pins that had been put in testimony a century ago, So it was quite an experience doing that research.
So what led you from that to, how did you get from there to becoming acting dean here at Rutgers? I'm jumping several years, I know, but.
Well, my career at Rutgers was a dozen years as a professor, a dozen years as dean, and then a dozen years as director of an Institute for Women's Leadership. So how did I get from here to there? Well, one of the ways I did was by getting involved almost immediately in a women's studies program that was being run by Elaine Showalter, who's a very, very well-known scholar in the field. And she started a program, and she jokes in the top drawer of her desk in her office. But she recruited all of us to be involved in it. And in those days, because we had collegiate departments, buildings shared departments. So in our building, Hickman Hall, we had philosophers, we had English department, we had the history department, and so we joke that we created women's studies on the elevator in Hickman Hall, but we really had an opportunity to have colleagues present. And I see that that's a drawback now in major institutions because so many departments have their own building and they want to have their own building, but it isolates them in some ways that are not healthy or useful.
What is it about the idea of women's studies? Why is women's studies important?
Well, initially, we thought we just had to tell women's stories from whatever perspectives we had, sociology, history, English, whatever, that we needed to fill in the stories. But what the historians have discovered, and certainly I feel this in the work that I did, I wrote a history of the family after I did the Victorian Murders book, it transforms the existing story. And that is a process that is not yet complete by a long shot. But if you work in a way that undertakes to see how people's lives changed in the household as well as in the wider world, you see our existing explanations for what made history work in different places are inadequate. And I think that's the very exciting thing about women's studies. Not only does it complete the story, it transforms the story.
So the Institute for women's leadership, I'm sorry, where we are now, the Institute for Women's Leadership?
Well, initially it was called it was the Women's Studies Institute. We just invented a bunch of names when we were early working on these things. And so it wasn't initially the Institute for Women's Leadership, but we focused on the name leadership because women were making progress in a number of areas, but where we saw the biggest need was in the top positions, or if you're looking at a formal structure, or at the informal structures, not enough women in leadership positions there either. So how can we work to use this mechanism of the women's studies that we've discovered to crack that nut of first, why is it happening that despite all the progress, they have such a hard time making it to the top? So it seemed to us that no matter what field you're studying women's lives, that was an issue that we had to deal with. So that's where the notion of an Institute for Women's Leadership came about.
So what were the obstacles to women becoming leaders, as you saw?
Well, some of them had to do with traditional gender roles in the household. In fact, that was very important. But already in the later 19th century, this had changed enough so that there was a more conscious male-led effort to keep women in the home, and thus, there's a back and forth on all of that. But ultimately, what did happen, and now as we know, women are the majority of students in colleges and universities in this country and in other developed societies. That helps to expose the fact that there has been a fair amount of discrimination for some time in our institutions, because even that majority of women who have actually better college grades and all the rest find it difficult that there's not an equal playing field once they get out into the wider world. But at the same time, for people who are sensible about this, and there are plenty of them, men as well as women, they recognize that we have to do something more positive to make that happen. Certainly in math and science fields where there had been such a paucity of women, programs were created, and certainly under my deanship at Douglas, that is one thing that I really stressed, because when I came in, they were in the process of consolidating all the departments. So each college did not have a separate English, French, Spanish, whatever department. And that meant that all the people in those fields were placed in one place. And we realized that Douglas, which had had more math majors than Rutgers College, for example, at one point in its history, was going to lose the math and science areas. The board then said to us, well, we will give you a science presence. And that meant one small department when we unpacked that statement. Well, this was when I was just beginning to be dean, and I was visited, sure enough, by a lot of gentlemen who were the heads of the small department saying, please, please don't make us be the science presence at Douglas, And I wanted to say, by having our department, the one that would be selected to be at Douglas, while all the rest of the science and math departments are sent off to Bush campus, which is now the place where all the science and math and engineering takes place. So we regrouped, and I talked to a number of the faculty members about what we might do. And the upshot was the idea to have a residence hall which, because we were a state university, we could have graduate students who were in math and science fields living on the top floor, 100 undergraduate women, lots of programs. We rehabbed a residence hall to be able to do this. We honored the two women who had been deans at Douglas who were scientists, Jewel Plummer Cobb, an African-American scientist, and Polly Bunting, who went on to be the president of Wellesley after she left Douglas. So it was a way of nurturing future leadership in math and science. And other institutions since then, I think we were probably the first institution that created a residence hall for women in math and science. But
very impressive. You said Polly Bunting became president of Wellesley. Wasn't she at Radcliffe?
oh, I'm sorry, she
Okay.
was at
You might
Radcliffe.
wanna-
Absolutely. Oh,
It's okay. I just wanted to.
and Jewel Plummer Cobb went on to be president of Fullerton in California.
So tell me about the two women who you named the Bunting Cobb Residence Hall after.
Well, Jewel Plummer Cobb, who was in fact the dean when I came in 1968. Marjorie Summers Foster was a transition in there, but in any case, Jewel was a very well-known and talented biologist, and she went on, when she left the deanship at Douglas, she went on to become president of Cal State at Fullerton. Polly Bunting, when she was at Douglas, that was before my time, but she did extraordinary things, including creating a program for older women, returning students, which survives to this day, and it's grown. It's called the Bunting Program, but when she established it, she was visited by so many faculty members whose wives had finally wanted, who finally saw an opportunity to get a college education. And she then realized that there was a whole population out there that could be advantaged if she created a special program.
I can't see Columbia or Harvard or Princeton saying to their professors, okay, we're going to start a program so that your wives can come back to school. What is it that's special about a public university that allows you?
What is special about a public university that it could start a program for older women as early as Polly Bunting did that at Douglas? Well, it had to include the factor that she was a decision maker and the head of a unit that was all female. And both those factors played into her ability to decide. Now, on one level, and I experienced this in my deanship as well, it was the ability to take action in various directions that could have long-term effects that was not vetoed promptly by the higher authorities. And certainly there were plenty of higher authorities at the university than the deans of the colleges. But the fact was they didn't pay the same kind of attention to those individual units. And that meant we could get going on lots of things without having to ask for permission to do it. I reported to the provost of New Brunswick. To him reported all of the deans at Douglas, and he held monthly meetings and so forth. So it was not as though we were sneaking around doing these things. I would have meetings with him and I would say what I was doing. But in general, there was a looseness in terms of the monitoring of our ideas to create programs. And as long as we were successful in doing this, as long as the students were happy, we proceeded.
The first women's studies program, is it women's studies or women's history that gets created? The Berkshire Conference got created here. Is it women?
I started that with a friend, but I'll tell you again, this was relying on Douglas, my mentor was a woman who had taught. Well, she graduated from Radcliffe and had a PhD in history. Margaret Judson was her name. And she became my mentor when I came here, even though she had recently retired after many years in the department. And as part of her mentoring, when I finally got my PhD, and I was here teaching at the time, she said, "Now is the time, Mary, that you must come up to the Berkshire Conference." Now, the Berkshire Conference then was just a group of women historians who had been excluded from the men's informal gatherings. And so they said, let's set up our own informal group. And when the idea of women's history occurred to a number of us, there was the Berkshire Conference, which was full of historians of all different fields. And I went to Margaret first, and I said, "Margaret, would you support us? Lois Banner, an American historian who is out at University of Southern California, and me, we belong to this group now, and we see that you're a perfect group to sponsor this." And they said, "Sure." And they gave us $500. And which went a little further in that day, but not a whole lot. And then we went and recruited people who were entering this new field of women's history. So yes, we ran the first Berkshire Conference on the history of women, which is what most people now think of that conference, but the smaller group still exists and thrives. But that was in 1973 that we had the first one at Rutgers University and at Douglas College.
How much did the activism of the civil rights movement and the unrest in the 60s play, what role did that play in the development of women's studies, do you think?
Well, certainly, as you suggested, it preceded it, and there was considerable activism on the part of the students at Douglas. Yes. And I think that it was part of the generating enthusiasm in creating an awareness of the students, and they had their own Black women's organization ready to go on the new programs that came up, and especially, they joined right in when we had the focus on women and women's history and women's leadership. So yeah, that was another part of
So Black women had an organization first, before the Berkshire Conference? Is that what you're saying? I'm just trying to understand the chronology.
Oh, before the Berkshire Conference? Well, yes, indeed. There were a number of, in fact, a couple of women on my staff were very influential in helping to support that. Maxine Summey was one of them, and Viola Van Jones, another, who encouraged students to participate and to take the women's studies classes and all the rest.
So was it a controversial idea?
Was it controversial?
At the time, was it well received when you first went to the provost and said, "Hey, I think we're going to start a program in women's studies"?
Well, until it became clear that not just Douglas, but all of the colleges established women's studies programs, and that it was a bigger item than the gentleman thought that it would be at Rutgers. Recall a friend of mine who was hired in the political science department at Rutgers College in 1971 or 2. She was the 5th woman ever hired by Rutgers College since its founding in 1766. So that gives you some sense of... Now, meanwhile, Douglas had an embarrassment of riches. We had a 3rd women faculty in most of our departments. Obviously, men were still... But right now, that constitutes really what is the case in most departments now. They're about a third women, and their chairs are more likely than not to be male. But it meant that there was another whole area within the university where women were taken more seriously at an early phase.
I remember applying to Douglas around that time and thinking that it would be so wonderful to have a community of women to support me instead of always fighting I wouldn't have had the words to call it a male hierarchy at that time, but that's what it in fact was. Did you get that a lot from students over here?
Did I?
Yeah, did you hear that kind of comment about the sort of the unique thing about being in a community of women scholars, being supported in academic research as being a special thing?
Well, in some ways, because my prior experience had been so bereft of women, I could not believe the richness in just this way, and the fact that there was an opportunity for us when a uniting factor that had to do with focusing on women's lives, it became possible for the women and increasingly some of the men. And that was interesting too. Now we have not half men in the women's studies programs, but a fair number of them. In the early days, there were very few, and the few were kind of special. People say, well, a lot of them were gays who were way ahead in the idea of gender, and that's certainly true. But more sadly, I had a couple of men who finally said to me, the reason that I took women's studies is that I wanted to find out how I could stop my father from beating my mother. So there were things that I learned that were beneficial. And the boys, the initial, I remember Jack, he couldn't even say it in class, but he happened to be an intern in the program and working for me, and I got to know him a bit, and he explained that that was why he was drawn to women's studies. Pretty heartbreaking.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, do you feel there's still a need for women's studies today? It sounds like you might say yes to that question.
I might, yes, I might. I definitely might. But I think there's also a need for more men to be encouraged and for more departments to think hard about offerings that don't just say women's and gender studies, and focus more self-consciously on them. Michael Kimmel was here in the sociology department before he went off to become yay great and famous with men's studies. And I give him full marks for that, for the work that he's done. I wish that there were more places, because I think what has happened with education is that women have become much more savvy about the role of gender in our behavior and our attitudes and all the rest than men are. And men are not uninterested in these things. They feel kind of awkward. We had a seminar. I, for 11 years, taught a seminar in the Institute for Women's Leadership's Women's Leadership program for undergraduates. And it was taught in the morning. The guys would come and pick up their girlfriends for lunch because it would let out around lunchtime. And the young women reported to me that all they wanted to do was find out what I had done. What did you learn? What did you talk about in there? They were curious. Now, in the early days, they weren't that curious. They thought it was kind of silly, but no longer. Well, it's overdue.
What did you talk about in there?
Yeah. What did I talk about? Oh, my goodness. It was a way of giving them a background in women's history and women's studies, and they were from all different departments and programs and fields. It wasn't just arts and sciences students. And so I thought it was important to give them a kind of quick overview of how women's studies emerged and how the interest in gender developed and so forth, and then to look at theories of leadership. We did a fair amount of that, and leadership in different communities. And then they went on. This was a program, and it still exists, that started when students were a sophomore, late sophomore, well, early juniors, really. And so I would start saying, what are you majoring in? Because it ended up being a kind of way to bring them out. And what would happen, I'll never forget one time, a student said, and this tells you something about a public institution. For long, of course, the little sisters did not get admitted to college, and the brothers did. But Douglas became a place where in New Jersey, the sisters could at least go to the state institution, you know. So I would hear what choices they were making, and one class, 2 women said what amounted to this: I'm majoring in economics and I don't know what it is. Now you can just hear the parents talking to them, can't you? My dear, if we're going to send you to college, you're going to do something that'll have practical results, you know? And they were candid enough to admit that they were taking it under pressure. And, you know, it's been one of our most successful programs. It's been running since the late 90s. And the students who graduate on their own, because so many of them settled in the New York, New Jersey area, have set up their own alumni association, had their own programs. So they've shown leadership in all sorts of ways, and they do for one another the kinds of things that men did, you know, introducing them to professional programs and just generally mentoring them into different fields.
When Douglas sort of, I wouldn't say disappeared, but Douglas did disappear as a college in the early 2000s. How did you feel about that as a former dean?
Well, Douglas has not disappeared, first of all. It's been interesting that it's been different, probably in marked ways, every 5 years. It's done different things, and it's been in different places. So when the alums come back very often, and I would tease them about it, because they would say, oh, the school is just not what it used to be. I mean, and then they would describe the Douglas of their day. So in that sense, largely, of course, because of shifts, additions of new units, and also the drumbeat of we need to look more like a real public university rather than like a collection of colleges. There was, yes, pressure to take away the formal structures that had maintained the college. And, of course, as you know, what has happened at this point is they succeeded with every one of the colleges except Douglas, which is still going. But, of course, it, too, has been obliged to alter. How did I feel about this? Sad, because I think we had a model here with the other colleges, and I would welcome their return, I have to say. It gives the students in a public state university the opportunity to have more intimate classes and discussions, to get to know their faculty members better. I mean, how can I count the ways that I think it's a wonderful model that every state university should have? And it should include a focus on women. We got ours sort of by accident because the Rutgers College trustees said, no, we will not accept coeducation until the early 70s when they finally did. It was they who said way back in 1918, well, all right, it was the Federated Women's Clubs, whose headquarters located down the road here. The Federated Women's Clubs women had importuned people in the university to admit women. And they finally put their finger on an interesting fact, which was that Rutgers was accepting public money. It had not yet been declared the state university. That didn't happen until the 40s and 50s that it became the state university. But they said, you folks at Rutgers are accepting public monies, and you must admit women. You can't exclude women if you're doing that. And a few of the trustees were moved by that. 3 of the trustees supported the idea. But the bottom line was that at that point, they wouldn't admit women as make the institution coeducational. So Mabel Smith Douglas, a graduate of Barnard, had the Columbia model in mind, and what she said was, all right, we'll create a separate college for women and on a separate campus. And they took money and land from the neighboring agricultural schools mainly land that they had access to. They purchased what became Douglas College, and the school had a separate budget from the state for many years. Even when I came to Douglas, they still had a separate budget, and the classes the faculty had to teach more classes than the men at Rutgers College. Even then, I had 4-3 loads, and the faculty members over at Rutgers College had 3-3. You know, it was just, that part of it was silly, but the overall effect for the students was still incredibly positive. So finally, when I look back, I think people should rethink what the opportunities are that they're giving to students in their public institutions and create programs. And of course, many of them have done that. We were able to do it a little bit earlier because we had what was then a very aberrant system of undergraduate colleges.
Okay, so as you look back now, so we have the development of this, that we're in the Institute for Women's Leadership as we do this interview. Why do we need an Institute for Women's Leadership? Why not just teach it in classrooms, do it as a bunch of colloquium? What's the advantage of having an institute here?
Well, it has advantages for faculty who know that if they have an interest in women and if they're teaching about women in their own field, that there is a wider group of people that they can get together with and share research. It has an enormous advantage for students. It is also the ratification of the idea that we have a need in our society for women to become leaders. And I think unless we declare that we have, it doesn't have to be an Institute for Women's Leadership. It's a perfectly good question. But if you don't, in an institute or in an institution of higher learning, if you don't honor a field with some kind of recognition, it doesn't exist. And that's why I think women's studies itself has spent so long in being approved, and then after it was created, a long time being accepted as an equal department. So I think we've learned that one way you do this is to play the game of becoming part of the institution in language that the institution understands. Meanwhile, in every department, people who aren't involved in the institute per se are still training leaders. I acknowledge that fully. This is not the unique place for women's leadership, but it helps to elevate the whole idea and research. It helps to support more research and to make it legitimate. Yes.
So I asked her what I should ask you, and she said, well, ask her how she feels about a shift in emphasis from women's studies to gender and sexuality studies. How do you feel about that?
Well, I feel fine about it, to tell you the truth. I really think that the more people recognize that that means them as well, and as our earlier discussion with regard to men's studies and the importance of sharing with men the language that they can use. They don't really very often think about it in ways that women's studies has spent years learning about. And so I have no trouble at all with expanding that whole area. And I think that sometimes we use it as jargon, and that puts people off too.
So the question I've been asked to ask is, so when you look back at sort of the milestone dates in the development of Douglas and the Institute for Women's Leadership, what would be the key dates? They don't have to be exact to the month, but like years.
The key things, well, first of all, having the receptive space that enabled like-minded people who had a common interest to develop that, not in their spare time, but in their company time, so to speak, and to make that recognized. That was very important. The other thing was the talent from different areas that we were fortunate to have. We had Alice Kessler Harris in the women's studies at one point. When I was dean, she was a major player. Another major player was Carol Smith in English, who was the head of the Institute for Research on Women. That was established back in the 70s. I think I was its first director, but it was one of those things that, okay, I'll be the director. It was no big deal. And then we had Ruth Mandel. She's now head of our Eagleton Institute of Politics, but back in 1971, she was the first real director of the Center for Women in Politics. Now, why did they allow a Center for Women in Politics in 1971? Well, I'll tell you a secret. Well, not such a secret. We had Mason Gross as our president then, and Florence Eagleton had given a gift. Florence, you heard that name, okay? She had wanted to establish an institution that would teach women, because the women students were here. It was really for the women students who were here about politics. Well, what happened was the Eagleton Institute of Politics emerged under Mason Gross, and it was a much larger enterprise than simply a program for women. In fact, initially it had no program for women. But then they remembered what Florence had said, and so they quick set up this program, which is why it was created so early. But it was vitally important for us as we thought about women's leadership to know that it was there and in place. Now it is the go-to place for any journalist in the country, for anybody who wants to know anything about women in politics. they go to the Center for Women in Politics as part of the Eagleton Institute. So that was a biggie. Now, what I was able to do when I became dean is to pull together people like those three women and others and talk about, okay, what do we need to do to take this thing to the next level and to make it possible for many more students to be exposed to issues that have to do with women's leadership and to see that women's leadership is in fact an issue that they need to start thinking about. If that background had not been there, it would have been very much more difficult to start an institute for women's leadership. But by the time I retired, we had 9 centers in the different faculties at Rutgers. And now we have Alison Bernstein, who is the director of the Institute, my successor. She's adding a Center for Women and Health, another Center for Women in Philanthropy. She was vice president of the Ford Foundation. And a third center on women in the media, and Gloria Steinem is the name chair who's loaned her name and her services and her multiple talents to the creation of that Center on Women in the Media. So it was able to expand and grow because there were a lot of people who cared about the subject. I hope that...
No, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great question. What do women bring to leadership that's different than men?
It's a very good question, and there's a lot of overlap, of course. But women continue, even now, to have different life experiences that are comparable. And so one of the things is that we're going to discover, as more women get into leadership, how they play it out differently. But I'm in the midst of reading Hillary Clinton's book. Her latest one is called Hard Choices. And she describes in elaborate detail, the book's 500 pages long, but she talks about her experience as Secretary of State and how she's visited over 100 countries and what she does when she visits. And she's aware that what she does is different. Yes, she meets with all the diplomats, she meets with the presidents, she meets with the elected representatives in democracies, etc. But she also says, and she prepares them in advance, I want to meet ordinary people in ordinary organizations. I want to be able to talk to people in religious groups, in other social groups, in neighborhoods. I want to know how they decide what are the problems for them in that country. Now, anybody can, of course, do that. But I think people like Hillary are driven because ordinary people who are female rarely have their lives visited, analyzed, and having policymakers ask them what's wrong, what's right, what would you like to see here? And that's, I think, something that women bring. And it's not just Hillary, but it was so beautifully stated in her book. I thought, I'll have an answer when people say, what's special about them? They really seek out the people whose voices are not heard, and they want to know what they think about the needs in their communities.
So you were saying, it's just that last bit, you were talking about the fact that it could be replicated. So what is it that's needed in order to, what are the questions that they have to ask in order to replicate what you do here?
Well, one of the things that I think that they have to do is to listen to the voices of women and of sympathizers with women who are not necessarily women. One of the things that I noticed at Douglas in the early days when I was a faculty member is that the men in our department who were senior men, and they had this combined history group, would come back raving mad from these meetings because, and they said, oh, the men over there at Rutgers College are such chauvinists. Because, they were teaching very smart women. They knew that but they were tainted by the fact that they were men teaching in a women's college, So one of the things that I would say is necessary is that you have to have enough administrators who are involved in programmatic planning in an institution to pull together the intelligence of women as well as men who are concerned about ensuring that women are validated in the college experience and don't have to keep going through the surprises. Still, so many women say once they're out of college, oh, I never experienced any discrimination when I was in college. It was when I go out, that I was discriminated against. Well, for Pete's sakes, there are ways of showing them that they may not feel that they have had that experience of discrimination, but that it does exist. Look at the way any institution that you are involved with, dear, functions. Look at the leaders, and then you will begin to answer a few of these questions in another way.
No, I'm sorry, my working title for this piece is From the Boarding House to the Boardroom, because women ran boarding houses at Rutgers before women were ever allowed to come to Rutgers.
That's very nice, yes. And of course, even in the advanced private institutions that brag about how they had admitted women early on. The women were often washing the guys' clothes and all that kind of thing.
Yes, in a way, women were still running things. They were running the house, and now they're running the big house, I guess.
Yeah.
That'll be the sort of the arc of the film. But are there graduates or women who have come through here that you've watched, whose careers you've watched? I don't want to put you on the spot. I won't hold you to them, but it'll just sort of be for my education, that you're proud of, who came through here, who've gone on to achieve. I mean, we know about
Oh, absolutely, no question. In elected officials, Jean Fox, who is the alumni director, was an officer in the cabinet of the governor of New Jersey. Lots of women in different fields around the country have made remarkable careers. On this one, I think it might be useful to get some little bios from,
I'll get them from you.
because I don't want to.
I know, it's always hard.
Yeah.
That I start trying to remember names from memory on the spot.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
that was it's not fair to the women
I
because
understand.
there's so many.
I understand.
Yeah.
No worries, no worries. So the Institute started here in 1977?
The Institute started in 1991, so everybody's having anniversaries. Of course, the university is having its 250th, but the Institute is having its 25th this year.
Wow, it's a lot of work. That's great that you've been able, that you're still here to see the legacies.
Well, I spend most of my time in Arizona. I retired officially in 2010, but I am on the advisory board, so I stay reasonably up to date with what they're doing. What we wanted to do in all of this, and maybe this is a partial answer, in my initial career, all I was doing was teaching Douglas College women. But even during those years, we became more open. Our students had to demonstrate in the early years that a course was being taught in one of the institutions across town or wherever that they couldn't get here at Douglas. And I found this stultifying. I mean, I love the idea of the different colleges, etc., but to restrict the students to to only their own faculty when there's such richness made no sense to me, which is, I think, one reason why they were quite happy to make me dean at the beginning. They weren't happy in all ways when they saw me doing what I was doing, but they were quite happy with that. Because that was their notion too, and I think it was important. But almost immediately, and I don't really want this for publication, so I don't want to be quoted on this, but what did happen is that we were told, oh, the professors will be, yes, they'll be just in one campus in their daily work, but they will teach courses on all campuses, and the professors will go to the students. Well, as soon as the professors were all together in their buildings, they did what all professors do. I want to teach my class in this building, and that's that. And they couldn't get them to go across town, or, so it was imperfect in a number of ways. But what happened with my desire once I left the deanship at Douglas was, in fact, during the time I was dean of Douglas, was to open our programs to students from other colleges. And so they are now, it's a real interchange, and not only from other colleges, but from other programs. And now, too, more students and faculty are involved in institute programs from Camden and Newark. New Brunswick is the sort of flagship institution. It has all the major graduate programs, etc. But, as Camden and Newark have grown, they have substantial graduate programs of their own, and of course the business program is located in Newark. My husband taught in that thing, and he created an institute for business ethics. What has happened is that a number of people, primarily faculty, are involved in the institute programs in different ways. Programs are shared with individual departments across those boundaries. So there's much more interaction of faculty. Students, much less. But even there, graduate students are involved.
So in a way, the Institute for Women's Leadership actually is a way that the different campuses and programs integrate with each other, which is also a woman's way of seeing the world.
Well, that's nice. Can I quote you? Yeah. I mean, I think that was not the initial idea, of course. It evolved that we had programs that were attractive or that we inspired programs. I don't think that the business school has a separate women's leadership program yet, and I see that as one possibility for another development. But it is certainly true that as I saw the ways that we could develop, it made more sense for me to leave the deanship and get involved with the wider university with this initiative, because there was just too much that we had to share and raise funds from other sources, because a lot of this was private money, and it made it awkward if it was a unit that really didn't look much like it was an undergraduate Douglas initiative. And so, it was time for me to move on. First of all, making the right choices about the needs of the institution and the people who are in it about what needs to change. You need experienced people, but you need those fresh faces who come in and say, why the heck are you doing this? And for long, I was the fresh face, and I wasn't even asking, why the heck are you doing this? You need to have smart people who for ages have been thinking about what needs to be done and haven't found friends. I guess the other thing I'd have to say is you have to have leadership that is confident enough to question what for many people is sacred. And that's very, very difficult because everything gets thrown into the sacred pile, and then you have to pick out the stuff that is not as sacred as the rest of the stuff.